The Rochester Symphony presents An Opera Affair, featuring the Rochester Symphony Orchestra and Chorale at Lourdes High School. Conducted by Maestro Jerry Lance. Richard Wagner, born, interestingly, just 5 months before Verdi, although Verdi outlived him a great deal. Wagner was the most controversial person of his time. In fact, if you look at who was the most written about in the 19th century, the number one was Napoleon. 2 and 3, Wagner and Verdi. People cared about art in those days, and they wrote about them. Well, Wagner changed opera and changed music more than anyone else of his time. He also changed theater. Before Wagner, the curtain always went up. Wagner invented the curtain that went sideways. Wagner invented the idea of turning down the lights during the performance so you could really focus on the stage. No one had done it before. He invented the idea of the covered orchestra pit so the orchestra was out of sight and a little bit muffled so it didn't overwhelm the sound of the singers. He also invented what's called the double proscenium, having 2 stage openings so that the person standing on stage looks much bigger than life than they would in a certain simple single proscenium. That was Wagner, a theatrical genius and a musical genius, but a colossal jerk. Now, we've had plenty of jerks in the history of music, we know. Beethoven was not nice. Mozart, if you've seen Amadeus, you know he wasn't nice. Wagner was worse. He would run up bills and just think because he was a genius, he didn't have to pay them. And of course, he wrote vituperatively about anybody he didn't like, and he wrote very nastily about Jews. At the same time, when he was older, he wrote his most Christian opera, Parsifal, though he didn't believe in Christianity at all. But the person he wanted to have conducted was Hermann Levy, not only Jewish, but the son of a rabbi. And Levy wrote home to his family, to his parents, "I hope you can come and meet this wonderful man who has been so kind and gentle to me. He is the nicest, richest, most rewarding man I have ever met." This from the son of a rabbi. So Wagner became controversial and was so criticized for what he did and how he did it. People said, well, he can't write anything but mythological stories. He can't write about real people. Secondly, he can't write unless it's for a huge orchestra. Third, he can only write slow music, not fast music. Fourth, he can only write this wandering kind of music. He can't write in specific arias, duets, choruses, orchestral pieces, which normally made up opera. Well, Wagner then wrote Die Meistersinger von Nurnberg, the Mastersingers of Nuremberg, and did everything that the critics said he couldn't do. He wrote faster music, he wrote it for a normal-sized orchestra, he wrote in the simplest key of all when he was criticized for writing atonal type music. He wrote in C major, he wrote about real people, all that sort of thing. He simply said, I write the way I write because I choose to, not because I can't. Today we have abstract painters and you swear they're painting this stuff that you can't understand because they don't know how to draw a human face. This was his human face, Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg. Wagner usually wrote about legends, about mythology, about gods and heroes. He was criticized for that, but at one time he wrote an opera about real people that took place in the 1500s, back in the city of Nuremberg, where the Mastersingers were the most respected people in town. Who were they? They were a guild that was entirely based on their musical ability, where they got together and created new songs about love, about life, about the land where they lived. And they could come from any walk of life to do that. The most prominent among them was a man named Hans Sachs. He was a cobbler. He made shoes. And although in town, in the social strata, the tinsmiths, the silversmiths, and the goldsmiths were above him, in the Mastersingers, he was the honored one. And at the end of this opera about the Mastersingers, we hear a tribute to this Hans Sachs. Because in the course of this opera, what Wagner did was talk about new art versus old art. Hans Sachs and his colleagues in the Mastersingers represent the establishment, the way things have always been done by careful rules that are applied stringently and are demanding, and your songs must conform. A young man named Walter comes along and says, no, I learned my music from the birds. I will sing as I want to. He's greatly criticized by the Meistersingers, whom he also holds in a very negative way. They're very much against each other. Hans Sachs resolves it by teaching Walter that the tradition has something good behind it, and he could learn something from it even as he explores his new avenues. And he teaches his old comrades that, hey, maybe a new talent coming along has something to teach us as well. And at the end, Walter is admitted to the Meistersingers because he recognizes the value of that establishment that's been there, and they recognize the value of the new young blood. And of course, Wagner, greatly criticized for his new ways, is saying, well, I respect the old ways, but I can make some new art too. He's doing a metaphor here in an opera about his own artistic contribution. The end of the opera is entirely choral, and it's absolutely beautiful. It opens with a text that's very helpful sometimes in opera performance. The choir sings Wach auf, meaning wake up. So in case you fall asleep in the introduction, they will wake you up with my favorite choral music from any opera, the finale from Die Meistersinger von Nurnberg. When you think of the list of great opera composers, Tchaikovsky doesn't come to mind. He wrote a number of operas, and in fact, he was, in a sense, the Mozart of the Romantic era, because he wrote more different kinds of music successfully than anybody else. He wrote symphonies, though not quite as good as Brahms. He wrote operas, not as good as Verdi and Wagner's, but nonetheless, he was the only person who wrote music successfully in that broad a spectrum of creation. But when you think of Tchaikovsky, you don't think of opera, you think of ballet. He was and remains the ultimate master of ballet. So instead of doing, in this concert, a piece for opera that's sung by chorus or individuals, we're doing a piece of ballet from his opera, Eugene Onegin, a Polonaise, and it's a great dance scene. are fans of Tchaikovsky's symphonies and concertos and ballet don't realize that he also wrote operas. He was not a great opera composer, although the opera from which that is taken, Eugene Onegin, I saw in a production in 1974 at Indiana University, had a beautiful opera program. It was marvelous. And we didn't choose arias and choruses from Tchaikovsky operas simply because what was he best at? Best ever at writing dance music, at writing ballet, so we chose a dance from Tchaikovsky. Now we move a little later than Tchaikovsky to the end of the 19th century and a new movement in Italian opera, verismo, meaning realism, true to life. And to that time, the operas had been about the upper classes. Now they were going to be about the real people, the people who lived close to the earth. Probably the greatest composer of that era was Giacomo Puccini, but he didn't write as wonderful a chorus in any of his operas as Pietro Mascagni did in the very first verismo opera ever created in 1890 by the 27-year-old upstart who made history by creating Cavalleria Rusticana, rustic chivalry. We hear two moments from it. First is a serene intermezzo, gloriously wonderful. And as beautiful as the music of Wagner was, both soft and loud, he could never have written anything this simple and absolutely gorgeous. This came from the pen of an Italian for sure. Then we go into the Easter prayer, and our friend Carol Nelson comes back to sing with us the role of Santuzza as the people in the street sing of the glory of the Easter miracle as they listen to the choir in the church. So we have our chorale representing both. First they sing in Latin in a very church-like piece that Mascagni created for the opera. It's not an authentic church piece, it's something Mascagni wrote to be church-like. And then the ballad comes in, which also celebrates Easter and is so rich and full of melody that it's absolutely beautiful. It's later in the play that all the murdering goes on. Okay, we're going to do the nice part before things turn dark. So one of my favorite pieces from all of opera, the beautiful Intermezzo and the Easter prayer from Cavalleria Rusticana.
The Rochester Symphony's concert, An Opera Affair, continues, featuring the Chorale of the Rochester Symphony, next week. Please join us. This activity is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. The Rochester Symphony Orchestra Presents is a co-production of KSMQ Public Television, the Rochester Symphony Orchestra and Chorale, and Rochester Symphonic Vision Productions.